I am Sarah Mitchell. Growing up in Manhattan's Upper East Side, I thought I had it all. Life seemed like a perfectly choreographed dance of luxury and privilege. My father, James Mitchell, was everything a daughter could dream of: successful, caring, and fiercely protective. After losing my mother when I was just 3, he devoted his entire life to giving me the world. And he did. Our penthouse overlooked Central Park, offering breathtaking views of the city that never sleeps. Every morning, I'd watch the sunrise paint the sky in hues of pink and gold, feeling like the luckiest girl alive. Dad built his empire from scratch, a tech investment firm that turned into a billion-dollar success story. Hard work and integrity, he'd always say, those are the only shortcuts to success. I believed him. I believed everything. Growing up in New York's elite circles meant my life was a constant whirlwind of charity galas, social events, and exclusive parties. Dad made sure I had the best education, sending me to Princeton where I majored in business and psychology. He wanted me to understand both numbers and people skills he said were crucial in our world. But despite our wealth, he kept me grounded. Money doesn't define character, Sarah, he'd remind me often. It's what you do with it that matters. Those words shaped who I became. Among Dad's inner circle was Richard Cooper, Harvard graduate, successful entrepreneur, and Dad's closest friend. They'd known each other since their struggling days, building their empires side by side. Richard was everything you'd expect in a successful Wall Street figure: tall, distinguished, always impeccably dressed in custom-made suits. His smile could light up a room, and his charm was legendary in our social circles. Uncle Richard, as I used to call him, was a constant presence in our lives. He'd bring me gifts from his travels: a silk scarf from Paris, handcrafted chocolates from Switzerland. Looking back, I should have noticed how his eyes lingered too long. How his compliments became more personal as I grew older. But I was blind to it all. In our world of Manhattan's elite, Richard Cooper was untouchable. He sat on multiple corporate boards, donated millions to charities, and had connections reaching from Wall Street to Washington. When he spoke at events, people listened. When he entered a room, heads turned. I remember the pride in Dad's voice whenever he introduced Richard to someone new. "This is my brother in all but blood," he'd say, clapping Richard on the shoulder. Their friendship seemed unbreakable. The summer after my graduation, Dad threw a celebration at our penthouse. The city's most influential people were there: CEOs, politicians, old money families. Richard gave a toast that night that brought tears to everyone's eyes. He spoke about watching me grow up, about how proud he was of the woman I'd become. "Sarah," he said, raising his champagne glass, "you're like a daughter to me." If only I knew then what those words truly meant. That night, Richard pulled me aside on our terrace. The city lights twinkled below us like fallen stars. "You've grown into such a beautiful young woman," he said, his voice soft. "Your mother would be so proud." I smiled, touched by his words about the mother I barely remembered. His hand rested on my shoulder, a gesture that had once felt paternal. But something was different that night. There was an edge to his touch that made me uncomfortable. I brushed it off as my imagination. After all, this was Richard, my father's best friend, my honorary uncle. The man who had been there for every important moment of my life. The weeks that followed were filled with job interviews and meetings. Dad wanted me to learn the business from the ground up, despite our family name. No special treatment, he insisted. Richard offered to mentor me, to show me the ropes of the investment world. Dad was thrilled at the idea. "There's no one I trust more," he said. I started spending more time at Richard's office. He'd teach me about market trends, investment strategies, and client relationships. But slowly, things began to change. His office door would always be closed during our meetings. His compliments became more frequent, more personal. He'd find excuses to touch my hand, my shoulder, my back. Each time, I told myself I was overreacting. Each time, I silenced the alarm bells in my head. After all, this was Richard Cooper, philanthropist, businessman, family friend. He couldn't possibly have ulterior motives. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. The annual Tech Innovation Gala at the Plaza Hotel was the biggest event of the year. Dad was the keynote speaker, set to announce a groundbreaking investment initiative. I wore a midnight blue gown that made me feel like a princess. Richard arrived early, looking distinguished as always in his black tuxedo. "You outshine every star tonight," he whispered as he kissed my cheek. The ballroom was packed with New York's finest. Champagne flowed freely, and the air buzzed with excitement. Dad took the stage, commanding attention with his presence. I watched proudly as he spoke about innovation and the future. About creating a better world through technology. That's when I needed to find the restroom. The plaza's layout was confusing, its corridors a maze of luxury. Richard noticed my hesitation. "Let me show you the way," he offered, ever the gentleman. I followed him through the ornate hallways. Away from the crowd. Away from safety. With each step, we moved further from the music and laughter. "Richard, are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, anxiety creeping into my voice. He didn't answer. Just kept walking. Finally, he stopped at a door. "Here we are," he said, his voice different now. Colder. As I reached for the handle, he moved. Quick as a snake. Before I could scream, he had pushed me inside. The door clicked shut behind us. And in that moment, my perfect world began to crumble. The bathroom lights were harsh and fluorescent. Richard's face had transformed. Gone was the warm smile, replaced by something predatory. Something that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. "I've waited so long for this," he whispered. His words sent ice through my veins. I tried to push past him, but he was stronger. Much stronger. "Please," I begged. "Don't do this." But the man I'd known my entire life was gone. In his place stood a stranger with cold eyes and cruel intentions. My screams were swallowed by the distant sound of music and laughter. The world continued to spin outside while mine stopped turning. I fought. I kicked. I clawed. But Richard Cooper had planned this moment. Had waited for it. Had orchestrated every detail. Time became meaningless. Minutes stretched into eternities. I prayed for someone to need the bathroom. For anyone to hear my muffled cries. And then, like an answer to my prayers, I heard it. My father's voice. "Sarah? Are you in here?" The door burst open. Dad stood there, his face transforming from concern to horror to rage. In that moment, he wasn't the polished businessman anymore. He was a father seeing his worst nightmare unfold. What happened next was a blur of violence and screams. Dad launched himself at Richard with a roar that seemed to shake the walls. Security guards appeared, drawn by the commotion. Someone wrapped me in a jacket. Voices shouted. Radio static crackled. The last thing I saw before shock took over was Richard's face, bloodied from my father's fists. The perfect mask had finally cracked. revealing the monster beneath. Then darkness claimed me. When I opened my eyes, I was in a hospital room. The steady beep of monitors filled the silence. Dad sat beside my bed, his knuckles bandaged, his eyes red from crying. "I'm so sorry, baby," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't protect you." Outside my room, I could hear hushed voices. Police officers taking statements. Doctors discussing trauma protocols. The word rape kit floated through the air like a poisoned arrow. My perfect world had shattered. And I was left to pick up the pieces. But this was just the beginning. The nightmare was far from over. The media caught wind of the story within hours. Wall Street titan arrested for assault. Manhattan's elite rocked by sexual assault scandal. Trusted friend turns predator. The headlines screamed across every newspaper and news channel. Our phones wouldn't stop ringing. Dad hired security to keep reporters away from the hospital. But nothing could stop the whispers. The speculation. The judgment. Some blamed me. Said I must have led him on. Others questioned why I followed him in the first place. The victim blaming was swift and cruel. But for every cruel comment, there were dozens of supporters. Women began coming forward. Other victims. Richard Cooper's mask had finally fallen. And the truth was uglier than anyone could have imagined. The detectives came to take my statement the next day. I had to relive every moment, every detail. Their faces remained professional, but I saw the anger in their eyes. One of them, Detective Martinez, held my hand as I spoke. "You're doing the right thing," she said. "You're incredibly brave." But I didn't feel brave. I felt broken. Shattered into a million pieces. The evidence was overwhelming. Security cameras had caught Richard following me. His DNA was found at the scene. My injuries told their own story. The Manhattan DA's office moved quickly. They wanted to make an example of him. A prominent figure brought down by his own depravity. Richard's arrest made national news. His face was everywhere, on TV, in newspapers, online. The charming smile now seemed sinister. His perfect image crumbled as more victims came forward. 3 women from his company. 2 from charity organizations. All silenced by his power and influence. Until now. Dad hired the best lawyers in New York. But they weren't just fighting for justice. They were fighting against Richard's extensive network. His connections ran deep. His friends were powerful. Money flowed like water to protect him. But Dad was relentless. "No amount of money can buy his freedom," he promised me. Not this time. The preliminary hearing was a circus. Reporters packed the courthouse steps. Photographers fought for shots of Richard in handcuffs. His expensive suit couldn't hide his fall from grace. I sat in the courtroom, Dad's hand gripping mine. Richard pleaded not guilty. His lawyer painted me as a confused young woman. Said it was all a misunderstanding. That I had invited his advances. I watched Dad's jaw clench with each lie. The evidence told a different story. Security footage showed him leading me away. Camera after camera tracked our path. His premeditation was clear. He had done this before. Known exactly where to take me. The prosecution built an airtight case. Text messages. Emails. Witness statements. A pattern emerged. Years of predatory behavior. Hidden behind wealth and influence. The other victims testified. Their stories mirrored mine. The same charm. The same grooming. The same violence. Each testimony drove another nail into Richard's coffin. His lawyer offered a plea deal. 15 years. The DA pushed for more. 20 years minimum. No possibility of early release. Richard's mask finally cracked in court. His charm turned to rage. He shouted at the judge. Claimed conspiracy. Called me a liar. But the evidence was undeniable. The jury took only 6 hours to decide. Guilty on all counts. 25 years. No parole for 20. Justice, they called it. But could any sentence truly be enough? The headlines celebrated the verdict. CT. Justice served. Predator behind bars. Manhattan's elite sexual predator gets 25 years. But headlines couldn't heal my wounds. Couldn't erase the nightmares. Couldn't restore my trust. Dad threw himself into making changes. He established a foundation. The Mitchell Foundation for Survivors. Providing legal aid and counseling. Supporting those without voices. Without resources. I started therapy 3 times a week. Learning to cope. Learning to trust again. Learning to breathe. Some days were harder than others. Panic attacks would strike without warning. Crowded places became challenging. Elevators impossible. But slowly, I began to heal. Dad never left my side. His business empire could wait. I was his priority. We moved to a new penthouse. Too many memories in the old one. Started fresh. Together. The foundation grew quickly. Survivors came forward. Seeking help. Seeking hope. I found purpose in their stories. In their strength. In their resilience. Months turned into a year. The media moved on to new stories. But the impact remained. Companies implemented stricter policies. Background checks became more thorough. The wall of silence began to crack. I started speaking at events. Sharing my story. Encouraging others to speak up. The nightmares became less frequent. The panic attacks more manageable. But the scars remained. Both visible and invisible. Dad's business thrived despite everything. His integrity shone through the darkness. Clients stayed loyal. Partners stood firm. The Mitchell name became associated with change. With justice. With hope. I learned to smile again. To laugh. To trust. Not completely. Not like before. But enough to live. To breathe. To dream. The foundation helped hundreds of survivors. Each story different. Each story important. Each story a reminder. That monsters wear expensive suits. That evil hides behind charm. That silence protects the predator. Never the prey. Dad and I grew closer through it all. Our bond strengthened by fire. By pain. By healing. He never forgave himself. For trusting Richard. For not seeing the signs. But I didn't blame him. How could I? The monster had fooled everyone. For years. For decades. Richard Cooper's name became synonymous with betrayal. His empire crumbled. His friends vanished. His legacy destroyed. But his victims? We rose. We healed. We survived. And in surviving, we found strength. In speaking out, we found power. In helping others, we found purpose. The Manhattan skyline still sparkles at night. But I see it differently now. Behind the glitter and glamour, behind the power and privilege, shadows lurk. Monsters hide. But so do warriors. Survivors. Heroes. I am Sarah Mitchell. And this is not just my story. It's a battle cry. A warning. A promise. That silence will not protect us. That money cannot hide truth. That justice, though slow, will come. And WH. And it does? It changes everything. 2 years after the trial, I stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., testifying before Congress about sexual assault reform. My voice no longer shook when I spoke. My hands no longer trembled. The Mitchell Foundation had grown beyond our expectations, helping thousands of survivors across the country, providing legal support, counseling, and hope. Dad sat in the front row, watching proudly. His hair had more gray now, but his eyes held the same determination, the same fierce love. My name is Sarah Mitchell, I began. And I'm here to tell you why silence kills. The senators leaned forward. Listening. Learning. Understanding. Our foundation's work had exposed a pattern. Of power. Of privilege. Of protection. Richard wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom. Of a system that protected predators. That silenced victims. That valued reputation over justice. But things were changing. Slowly. Steadily. Surely. Companies now had stricter policies. Background checks were more thorough. Victims had more support. More voice. More power. The Mitchell Foundation expanded internationally, opening offices in London, Paris, Tokyo. Wherever money and power created shadows, we brought light. Dad's business transformed too, now focusing on ethical investments, supporting companies with strong moral codes, creating change from within. I started dating again. Carefully. Cautiously. My therapist said it was progress. Dad was more protective than ever. But he understood. I needed to live. Not just survive. The first time I laughed freely again. It surprised me. The sound unfamiliar. But welcome. Like an old friend returning. I learned to trust my instincts. To recognize red flags. To speak up. To fight back. The foundation launched an education program. Teaching young people about consent. About boundaries. About respect. We partnered with universities. Created support networks. Built safe spaces. Changed lives. Richard Cooper's appeal was denied. 23 more years to serve. Justice held firm. Truth prevailed. His victims continued to heal. Some joined our foundation. Others found their own paths. All survived. Dad finally forgave himself. It took time. Therapy. Understanding. You're my hero, he told me one night. You've turned pain into purpose. I hugged him tight. Grateful for his strength. His love. His unwavering support. The nightmares became rare. The panic attacks almost gone. But the awareness remained. The knowledge that monsters wear suits, drive luxury cars, hide behind charity galas, and perfect smiles. But now I was stronger, wiser, ready to fight, to protect, to change. The Mitchell Foundation became a beacon of hope, of change, of justice. We created a hotline, 24/7 support, legal advice, emergency help. Survivors called from everywhere, sharing their stories, finding their voice, building their strength. I met someone, a lawyer working with domestic violence survivors. He understood, respected boundaries, showed patience, earned trust. Dad approved. After thorough background checks, multiple references, and constant vigilance, life moved forward. Not the same as before, but maybe better, stronger. The foundation's work continued, growing, expanding, helping. We created support groups, safe houses, legal funds, hope funds. Each success story mattered. Each survivor counted. Each voice heard. Each life changed. The Manhattan skyline still sparkles. But now I see beyond the glitter. See the strength, the resilience, the power of speaking up, of fighting back, of surviving, of thriving. I am Sarah Mitchell, survivor, warrior, champion, and my story continues. Not in silence, but in strength, in purpose, in hope. For every victim who hasn't found their voice, for every survivor fighting to heal, for every person trapped in silence, we stand with you. We fight for you. We believe you. The monsters may hide in plain sight, but so do heroes. And together, we are stronger than any shadow, any fear, any silence. This is my promise, my purpose, my truth, and I'm just getting started. End.